Welcome back to this week's episode of Wicked's Wicked Reptiles. Today we're going to talk about the 5 worst reptiles for beginner reptile keeper. What is it that you should reconsider bringing home as your first or your next reptile? Stick around. Just to clarify, any pet on this list, any of these reptiles, possibly could make good pets if you are an advanced keeper, you really know what you're doing, and you really put in the effort and the time to give these animals the best possible environment that they could possibly live their life in, which is really difficult, which is why they're all on this list. So, with no further ado, let's get started with number 5. Number 5, big stuff. I'm going to be pretty specific through the entire video, but this one just goes without saying. If you're a new keeper or you're a novice keeper, you don't have a ton of experience, anything really big is probably not the best animal to start out with. I'm talking about Burmese pythons, anacondas, reticulated pythons, crocodilians, giant lizards, tegus, monitors is what I'm trying to say there. Any of these animals, they need a huge housing space, right? They need a huge enclosure. Most of them need crazy humidity or temperature or both type of configurations that are going to be really hard for you to monitor. You definitely can't go away for a week with most of these animals. A lot of them take a lot of money and time to feed, and there's a risk involved too. If you keep a crocodilian, or if you keep a Burmese python or something like that, or let's suppose you keep yourself an African rock python or a big huge reticulated python, there's a very slim chance, but there is a chance that they could very seriously injure you. And I'm talking about maybe even death. And this is something that's very rare. I can't even think of one instance off the top of my head where a retic has killed its owner. But I'm sure that could happen, and we've seen it before where wild retics will get a hold of a small man or a small woman, and that's its lunch, basically, right? Someone goes missing, you cut open a snake, and you found Uncle Bob, you know? But I think that this is a bad idea for a beginner. Just too much space. It costs a lot of money to feed them. If you don't know what you're doing, you might get hurt, especially when it comes to like giant crocodilians. Like, this is probably a bad idea for anybody who doesn't have a giant outdoor enclosure, who really knows what they're talking about and what they're doing. So number 5 is big stuff. Number 4 is something that's actually pretty common and pretty cheap to bring home, and I think you're going to see a trend with the pricing of these animals. Now, this is a Brazilian rainbow boa. Brazilian rainbow boas are, in my opinion, maybe the most, one of, if not the most, beautiful non-venomous snake that you can keep. And to be honest, they're not crazy difficult, but they do have one thing that separates them from any other type of boa constrictor or pythons or something that looks similar to someone, you know, that doesn't really know a lot about snakes, and that is they have crazy humidity requirements. We're talking 80 to 90%, depending on which care guide you look at, of course. These guys need a lot of humidity, so that means a big water bowl, you need to mist them down, and this takes a lot of work. You can't go away for a week unless you have an automated misting system, and even then, what if it breaks, you know? Where with a leopard gecko, I feel very confident that as long as I have everything set, like a surge protector, and my timer is connected properly to my thermostat, which has a night drop, I have left leopard geckos for a week. I wouldn't suggest leaving animals alone for a week at a time, but what I'm saying is even 2 days is too long to leave a Brazilian rainbow boa without checking on it. Should be checking your reptiles all the time, but if you go away on a business trip and no one's there to take care of your animals, a Brazilian rainbow boa is not for you. You have to check these guys constantly, and of course too, they do get kind of big, not crazy big. I wouldn't put them in this category because of their size. It's just simply, especially when they're babies, you need to be approaching 90% humidity. It's really difficult to keep it there. If you're not more of an advanced keeper, this is going to be probably pretty difficult for you, I would imagine. I had a buddy who long ago, before Brazilian rainbow boas were even affordable, like they were $1,000 a piece at the time, he had 2 of them, and neither one of them made it. He did a pretty good job taking care of them, but even then, like spraying them twice a day, he'd come back and the humidity was at like 65 or 70%, especially if you live somewhere cold. Like if you live in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan or like Niagara region of Ontario, like where I live here, you're never going to be able to keep that temperature if your enclosure, or that humidity rather, if your enclosure is near a furnace. It's going to be really difficult. So Brazilian rainbow boas, although they are good pets, if you know what you're doing and have the time and dedication, they are not for beginners in my opinion. Number 3, Sulcata tortoise. And a lot of people will say that's pretty darn obvious. Of course you're not going to get one of the biggest tortoise species in the world as your first pet, or if you're a novice, you're not going to get one of these. Yeah, you'd think that. But the next 3 on this list, including this one, are all going to have the same thing in common. They start off really small, they're really cute, and they're really cheap. Sulcata tortoises at an expo, you can get them for under $100 sometimes. These guys, they're a dime a dozen. When they put out eggs, they put out a lot, and they're really easy to come by. These guys are gigantic though. Sulcata tortoises are freaking huge, and they need a lot of space. They need UVB and lots of it. They need heat and lots of it, and they need to eat a lot of food as well. And they grow really slowly, so there is a chance, which is why they're so low on the list, that you could catch up, and there's a learning curve, but you could catch up to it if you have the space. But that's the thing too. If you keep them inside, you basically need a room. You need a room for these guys. If you wanted to have a reptile room where you had a designated space, and we're talking about like 8 by 4 feet of space where you could put UVB over it in a basking spot or several, sure, go for it. But how many people do you know just have 8 by 4 feet just laying around with the prop? It's really difficult is what I'm trying to say here. If you can keep them outside all year round, that would make it a lot easier. If you live in Arizona, for example, give her. That's a different thing. Make sure you do your research first. I shouldn't say just give her. Like, don't just go and get a Sulcata tortoise if you don't know what you're doing. Don't let the small size of them fool you. When they're babies, they are absolutely adorable, but that goes away. Not really quickly. It takes years and years. The other thing, too, is they're going to outlive you for sure. Even if you are a 5-year-old getting a Sulcata tortoise, you're going to die before this thing does of old age if you take care of it properly. And I don't think that's always a bad thing, because with reptiles, rehoming them isn't like a dog where they get attached to you. For the most part, I'm sure there's some that, would disagree with me when I say that. But they're not going to get super attached for you, wait for you by the door for the most part. But at the end of the day, tons of room, need the UVB over a large portion, lots of basking spaces. It's just not a good idea for a beginner. Number 3, Sulcata tortoise. Now your next 2 are super common. You see these basically in every reptile store, definitely at every expo, and sometimes even at like a regular pet store like a Petco or a PetSmart, which you shouldn't be buying reptiles at if I haven't hammered that home enough lately. And this is a chameleon. Now, I'm not going to be super specific, veiled, panther, Jacksons, whatever. Chameleons in general take a lot of work, and they need special requirements. For example, I learned this through someone who I was friends with who had a chameleon. She was obsessed with this thing to the point where no matter what it was, most people don't take the reptiles to the vet every year for a checkup. This chameleon went every 6 months. She had a camera checking on this thing constantly, and when I finally asked her, like, are you a crazy person? Why do you do this? I did a little bit more research, and I found out they're very fragile. They live 5 to 7 years. Of course, different species and localities are different, but in general, from the research I've done, so they don't last a long time to begin with. They're going to cost a lot of money to set up. Generally, they need a misting system, they need UVB light, they need a basking spot. But what's different about their caging requirement is they need a vertical space, which isn't super uncommon. But what is uncommon, generally, is they need a breathable cage or a mesh cage. So they make these generally specifically for chameleons. They need airflow because they can get respiratory problems and other things with stagnant air. So it's a little bit different, and you have to keep them in a room where the ventilation is good enough where they're not going to have a stagnant air type of issue. A lot of people use fans, and of course, if the humidity's not right, because it's not contained as much, because it's a mesh container or a mesh enclosure, it's being exposed a lot more to the environment in your room or wherever you're keeping them. So you might need a humidifier or dehumidifier for the entire room. So basically the entire room needs to be, it's a lot of work. Plus, they don't drink from standing water, so you're going to need a dripper system or at least a misting system. So that's another thing too. And their diets are really weird. Not weird, but you have to tongue feed them a lot of the time, right? Most people I know who have chameleons suggest that you don't just dump a bunch of crickets in there and hope for the best. They generally tongue feed them, which can take a while to learn and get them to learn. It's just a lot of work. With reptiles, you want something that's kind of a lower maintenance pet. That's one of the big things that was a selling point for me, because sometimes if I just want to go away for 2 days, I like the option of being able to do that and just take care of everything, and you come home and everything's alive still. But with a chameleon, I mean, my friend probably went overboard, and you probably don't need a camera that you can literally check on your phone all the time. But they do take a lot of work, and they're predisposed to a lot of issues. Calcium binding is one of them that I've done a bunch of research on as well. Of course, I'm no expert on chameleons. I've never had one. These are just things that have prevented me from getting one. Because when I was a kid, I remember seeing one at a pet store for 40 bucks, and my dad was gung-ho, we're going to get a chameleon. That's the coolest thing. And I'm glad that we never did, because that thing would have died pretty quick. We had no idea what we were doing, and that was in the 90s before the internet was a big thing. No matter how much research you do, just go in knowing it's going to take a lot of your time, maybe as much as a dog or something. Like, these are not your regular reptile pets. They take a lot of time. And also, by the way, some chameleons can get pretty grumpy. They're not going to be able to really damage you, but it's no fun handling something that's hissing at you all the time. So that is why I'm giving number 2 to chameleons. Before we get to number 1, I'm going to do an honorable mention, and I'll take this time too. Thank you, everybody who has subscribed to this channel. If you noticed, we're in 4 digits now. We had 1,000 subscribers this week. I can't even believe that we did this in less than a year. I know that that's maybe not a huge number, but to me that is. Thank you guys so much. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. Honorable mention, bearded dragons. And a lot of people are going to say, I thought that was a regular pet for a beginner. I thought that was the best beginner pet. It's not. A lot of people have these on their list, and again, they're cheap, they're easy to find, but they're not great for someone who's brand new. I mean, if you're an intermediate and you do your research and you understand, you know, variety and diet and supplementation and UVB and all this, yeah, go for it. They don't take up that much space. I would suggest probably a 75-gallon is what I would like to see you have a bearded dragon in. I used to have bearded dragons. It was my first reptile. I just kind of walked into a situation where a friend of mine had one, couldn't keep it, and I wanted a reptile. And I started paying rent at home, and I said, yeah, Mom and Dad, if I'm paying to stay here, I got myself a reptile. And what I should have done is got a leopard gecko, which I did a few months later. But this bearded dragon, I learned quite a bit. I learned a lot about what UVB means, like that type of light, the spectrum of light, and how to properly facilitate that, changing of the bulbs, a varied diet. There was a lot of learning as you go, and I think that I would have been better off learning with a leopard gecko because there's less to learn, and then it builds your curiosity, and then you can take on something bigger and bigger and bigger. Now, I understand some people will say this promotes hoarding because then you're just getting a bunch of stuff as stepping stones. I kind of disagree with this. That's another episode we're going to do all about. Bearded dragons, UVB, varied diet, a whole bunch of supplementation. They get kind of big. You need a 75-gallon aquarium or equivalent, of course, probably. And then humidity has to be super low, often lower than your house. So they're the honorable mention. So let's get on to number 1. What is number 1? Iguanas. And this is something that's been kind of a theme throughout the entire video. They come really small, they're really cute, and they're in every pet store. When I was a kid, this is the go-to reptile that was in every pet store no matter which one you went to. But something that is undebatable about iguanas is that they get very big. These things get sometimes 5 feet, they got a giant tail. They're going to need a custom enclosure. There's no way that you're going to be able to buy anything off the market for the most part. Definitely not like a pet store. You could probably source something that someone could make for you or a specialty store, but no PetSmart or Petco or even a regular reptile shop is going to have something suitable for an iguana. So you're going to need a lot of space to have this thing in, and it's going to be expensive. So your $35 iguana is going to need like a $500 type of enclosure if someone custom builds it for you, or at very least it's going to cost you $150 to make one probably. Never mind the UVB light that you need and the high basking spot and the humidity requirements that you're going to have to do. These guys take a lot of work. And not only that, but even if you do get them set up and you have someone that has an enclosure built for you, these guys are not very fun to handle for the most part. They've got giant claws, they have a big tail that they will whip the crap out of you with. These guys are difficult to tame down, and even if you do tame them down, from what I understand and from people who I talk to who actually have iguanas, they will switch just like that. They are the nicest iguana 1 minute, and then the next minute they want nothing to do with you. They do have teeth that they can bite you with, claws, tail. They're just really difficult, and they're hard to manage their personality is what I'm trying to say. Also, big varied diet and the space requirement, and you might get hurt because it does not feel good to get bit by an iguana. I know a guy who I watched an iguana bite him on a video that he made, and it like literally took a chunk out of his arm. It looked awful. But again, the reason this is number one is because they're so common. They are literally like 30 bucks or 40 bucks. They're the easiest thing to acquire. They're almost as easy to acquire as like a leopard gecko or a bearded dragon, which is awful. These things are the most common reptile that you'll find in a rescue because everyone gets them when they're small and they realize very quickly, these things are not for me. They're not for beginners. Iguanas are by far and away my number one do not get worst pet reptile for a beginner or someone who is an advanced keeper. There's your list. Thank you very much for watching this episode of Wicked's Wicked Reptiles. I really want you to put down in the comment section below if you agree or not, or what I should have put on or what I should have excluded from this list, because I know it's a bit controversial and I know it's a lot of an opinion-based thing more than anything else. And I've never owned any of these reptiles except for the honorable mention, which was the bearded dragon. So until next week, because I do videos every Monday and Thursday, that means that I'll see you on Monday.